I'm going to close the chapter on Kant and start a new chapter with the discussion of Hegel. Okay? Do you have any questions before we step into this new one? Apparently, it seems that you don't have any questions. You have? Please. Yeah, it appears so. Yani, the organization of the ideas, okay, when they are rule-bound, it appears within Kantian thinking they are the work of understanding. Okay, understanding so does not operate arbitrarily. Okay, it has its own rules and it demands coherence. It demands all the ideas and the organization of the ideas should abide, should respect, should act in accord with its own rules, its own dictates. Okay, but this is not the case with the imagination. Imagination appears as a much more free faculty, okay, freely operating faculty, so that it allows any idea to be connected with any other idea in any other possible way. Okay, it appears to be the major difference between imagination and understanding. You can say actually that understanding rests on the faculty of imagination, but having different and peculiar rules of its own, demanding obedience to these rules. Yeah, obedience from all possible appearances of consciousness. Okay. So we can differentiate such images of ours, which are freely connected with each other, from the images of understanding, which we prefer to call actually concepts, and relating concepts with other concepts, judgments. And judgments are primarily understood as bits and parcels of knowledge. Okay? So we can say that if the concepts and their organizations, ideas, their organizations, appearances, their concepts and their organizations are rule-bound, we can say that we can understand things. However, we are, of course, left free to imagine whatever we like, on the other hand. So I do not know if it is a satisfactory answer. But there's no such rule in my, I don't know, in my cognition. In consciousness. Yeah, that's why I know that it's imagination. Yeah, exactly. Any other question? Okay, and as you may understand, I don't know how far was I able to present Kantian thinking in a rather coherent and easy to understand manner. I don't know, of course. But the major feeling which is left by Kantian thinking within the tradition was rather kind of frustration. People didn't like its consequences, as we shouldn't like them as well. Okay? Simply because in the final analysis, it culminates in a kind of negation of any possibility of having true knowledge on the part of the human beings, us. Okay. Now, for instance, what do we do here at a university? We are trying to, according to our claim as scientists, we are trying to produce knowledge. We are trying to produce knowledge on society, knowledge on chemical substances, knowledge on physical events, so on and so forth. Okay, Yeah, all we are trying to do is to say which is something true about all these things, if there are really things. Okay? So, yani, somebody coming along and telling us that all knowledge that we claim to have are actually not related with the things, not related with the world, but nothing else than the expression of the rules of our own understanding. Yani, this is quite a real frustration. Okay? And we are doing nothing here in universities, producing nothing else than what we already have in our minds, okay? We are not dealing with the world, all we are expressing our own rules of understanding. What kind of knowledge is this? Okay, this is not knowledge. Actually, Fichte reacts to this situation by calling everybody in as one of the popular and very famous speeches. Faith and knowledge, knowledge and faith. Okay? And rejecting knowledge in a rather angry and frustrated fashion calls everybody to faith. And if knowledge doesn't help us any longer, what's left for us to defend, okay? Other than faith. Okay, this is one of the reactions. So everybody was left unsatisfied and they were trying to come by with solutions, okay? And after, and together with, not after, it was Fichte first started the analysis to find out this, or a way to overcome this duality in Kantian thinking. This duality was, of course, related with the separation of the nominal from the phenomenal. If you like, nominal versus phenomenal. If you like, the world as it is, or the world of things in themselves, and the world as it appears to us. Or the world of things for us. Okay. Now, to be able to overcome this duality, actually the major strategy, which was open to them, or if you like, preferable for them, was to suggest the unity of the world on the ground of thinking. This is why later Marx would call Hegelian thinking as an expression of idealism, you know. So, actually this has been done in a rather interesting fashion. For instance, in Fichte's, actually Fichte started all this, I guess, by pushing the Kantian arguments to their extremes, actually. Fichte arrived at a certain idea, okay, that actually would prove to be quite influential in later thinking as well. He interpreted or emphasized, actually, this was already there in Kant, okay, thinking as an activity, or if you like, act. It was a rather, however, strange act, a double act, double movement. First of all, suggesting that, you know, it has been one of the major suggestions with regard to the faculties of the spirit in contradistinction to the body, that it was free, okay? It was free, meaning that it was capable of infinite thinking, okay? Therefore, thinking, suggesting itself to be an infinite or having the infinite capacity or potential, okay, as an activity, okay, it begins to imagine itself as a potentially at least infinite activity, but finds itself limited in each and every actual act of its own. Okay. For instance, it has this potential of thinking infinity, up to infinity, but practically speaking, in each and every act of thinking, it thinks something. Okay? Which means that falling short of its potential. Okay? Falling short of its potential. And this actual limit, if, for instance, it starts from the point A, having the potential to extend itself to the vector C, okay? Practically speaking, it ends up at point B, thinking something, okay? So, as you can see, Fichte began to interpret this threshold as the threshold separating the I, the famous I, German Ich, okay? Later on, usually translate into English as ego. Okay? Separate a threshold separating the ego from not ego, or not I, or nicht ich. Okay? Simply because it was actually performing up to this point B, the task of thinking, but while in the meantime thinking that it has still the potential that can go beyond that point, but actually never going there. Okay? So this suggested, if you ask me, suggested potential within the structure of thinking did exactly constitute the part of the world which was not the I or my thinking itself. Okay? Now, this means that all the totality of the world, which we call, for instance, internal and external, okay, are nothing else than the thinking itself. Okay? So thinking itself contains the all of the totality of the world, even before it has been separated as an I or consciousness in the example of Kant, and the world of noumena. Okay? What remains external to actual thinking of thinking, which stretches itself on thinking's potentiality once again, okay, is turned out to be identified as the external world from the point of view of the actual consciousness. Okay? So up to that point, it's the internal world. Beyond that point, it's the external world. Okay? Outside world, outside the world, outside of the actuality of my thinking at a given time, at a given act of thinking. Okay? Here, the objectification of this point, B, okay, gives us the entities of the external world. Okay? That was quite an interesting idea, a very powerful idea actually, simply because, yeah, if you really think about the problem, okay, you'll find out that for your consciousness, there is no any other way to interpret even the simple possibility of the existence of the external world. Okay? The strange point was that, and this point has been strongly emphasized and successfully emphasized in Kantian thinking, that thinking cannot go outside of itself. It forever remains immanent into itself, a prisoner in its own self, if you like, okay? Which means that any possibility for thinking of the existence of another external world should or can only be established inside the structure of thinking. Okay? Yani you may believe, there's no problem with it. You may believe that there is an external world. Okay? You may be very well convinced of it as well. There is no problem about it. The problem here is to establish the grounds of the existence of the external world on a basis of knowledge. The problem is knowing here, okay, not believing. Otherwise, we may have our own preferences with regard to believing in this or believing in that, there's no problem with it, okay? Everybody is free to believe whatever they like to believe in, okay? They choose to believe in. There's no problem with it. But if at the moment when we try to establish the existence of the world, existence of the things, for instance, existence of ourselves, for instance, as bits and parcels of knowledge, in other words, on the ground of knowledge, if we are willing to claim a knowledge with regard to these problems, then Fichte's strategy seems to be the only possible, actually, okay? Only possible or available in those times. Later on, we are going to find out, we are going to try other strategies as well. Only available strategy for this, okay? But it has its own advantages as well. As you can see, both the existence of the internal and external world has been established on the same ground, okay? On the ground of thinking. This is why Hegel would adopt this strategy later on, and why Marx would call him as idealist, simply because according to this line of thinking, actually it amounts to saying that the only ground of existence is thinking, thought. It is very old idea, actually, going back to the ancient Greek thinkers, and Anaximander, for instance, saying that the ground of existence was nous, you know, thought. And you know, mark the similarity. They are actually from the same root, you know. Similarity between the term nous and nominal, okay. Nominal meaning existing in nous, okay. So everything actually was there, and Fichte picked up the opportunity, and he wrote a very influential and famous book. Later on, under the shadow of Hegel, his thinking began to be forgotten. Well, I can say that Hegelian thinking opens itself up on the Kantian grounds, opens itself up with the devices supplied by Fichte and so. Even though later on, first Hegel, Fichte, Schelling and Hegel began to work together. Later on, Schelling and Hegel would divert their paths from Fichte's, and later on Hegel would start to stand on his own feet, okay? Fine, but they worked together on these projects, okay? Now, this also, such a model also opens the way for the possibility of, interestingly enough, and for the first time perhaps in history, okay, thinking about all these matters in terms of a certain historicity, okay. If you ask me, the Hegelian moment in thinking actually is the discovery of the modern historicity as well, okay. Yeah, and you may say that, come on, man, yeah, what are you saying? Yeah, and people wouldn't be aware of history, the existence of history in earlier times. Yeah, from the ancient Greek times on, in other civilizations, almost some 5,000 years ago, in ancient Chinese civilization, people began to write down histories or historiographies, etc., etc. So how come the history can be discovered at about the beginning, end of the 18th and beginning of the 19th century? Ah, do you say so? Just simply take a look at the early conceptions of history in early sociological theories will show you that how primitive, even in sociology in the beginning of 19th century, how weak and undeveloped and simple the understanding of history was. Say, for instance, history understood, for instance, in the writings of Emile Durkheim, as a movement of societies in time from simple to complex structures based upon increasing division of labor. This means that history has only one single mechanism, division of labor, okay? and two basic stages, okay? And a beginning and an end, from simple to complex societies. What kind of developed conceptualization of history is this? Okay. Or think about certain insertions of history in theories of the passage from Gemeinschaft to Gesellschaft. Community to society. Again, we have a very simple, unsophisticated, unworked out notion of history here at work. Okay. Now, therefore, when I say actually the Hegelian moment should also be considered as the discovery of history as we understand the term in modern times, okay, I guess this has to be taken seriously, I hope. Okay. Okay, how Hegel achieves this? First of all, again, the idea was there in Kant, but Kant did not work it up to its logical conclusions. Thinking was an act, you know. Thinking was an act, and while its acting was an actuality, if you like, its own realization, okay? Its own realization. Without this act, thinking, just by stopping, not moving, thinking cannot realize itself, okay? So only by acting it can realize this. And acting, the idea of action, okay, immediately brings into the picture the notion of temporality. It was already there, okay? An act takes place, or if you like, a movement takes place in time as well as in space, okay? So, actually this model was the basic model helping all these people to overcome the dichotomy. Actually, later on, if you like, okay, Hegel would begin to interpret this part as the expression of the alienation of consciousness from its own self, okay? So that what consciousness comes to recognize as its externality, or if you like, as the objective external world, turns out to be nothing else than its own expression of its own alienation from itself, okay? That was the major. Actually, this idea was so influential that it found its way into Marxian thinking, up to Marxian thinking as well. Even today, we are talking about alienation. Okay. In what sense? Okay. Why alienation? Okay. For us to be able to talk about alienation, we should primarily presuppose that which is alienated was an intrinsic part of that which has been alienates itself. Okay. So, okay, so much is enough for Fichte. It was just an introduction to Hegelian thinking. Okay. This model involving temporality, of course, also involves the idea of change, however. Okay. Nothing is innocent. Okay. If you take something in, that something comes always with a certain package. Okay. I'm now making tiny little suppositions, emphasizing the idea of the character of activity in thinking, therefore calling into the picture the question of temporality, and therefore necessarily, which is followed by the idea of change. Okay. Now, this appears that actually Kant never rejected the possibility of change, but what was fixed and unchanging in his frame of thinking was the categories themselves. Okay. The categories are naturally given characteristics of human understanding. So once you are a human, you are almost guaranteed, of course, as a member, individual member of species, to display these characteristics with varying degrees. Okay. I am taller than you, you are stronger than me, etc., etc. But And we do share the same categories, and the same categories are there over and over, generations after generations. Okay? Now, however, when I introduce the idea of temporality and followed by the idea of change, you would already expect, or you can begin to expect that that idea would create a certain impact on this structure. Okay? And that impact would culminate in the historical interpretation of the development of consciousness. Now, we have seen that we are already starting by the suggestion that, Fichtean supposition that, actually taken from Kantian arguments themselves, okay, supposition that what consciousness comes to recognize as the external world is nothing other than its own alienated parts. Okay? This already eliminates the problem. Okay? All existence has already been defined based upon on the grounds of thinking itself. Okay? Therefore, this thinking grounding every existence would be called by Hegel as Geist, spirit. Okay? Thinking itself. Yes, as individual human beings, it's our own thinking on the one hand, okay, nothing else. But as thinking as such is not limited to our own individual human existences, okay, it's thinking at large at the same time, okay. We individual human beings actually displaying certain examples of its actualization, nothing else, okay. Simply because the thinking at large cannot be shrunk down to thinking of one and single individual human being. There are other human beings as well engaged in this very same activity or whatever it is, okay, expressing its historical reality at a given moment, at a given place. That's interesting. Now, when I introduce the notion of change, you can expect that the structure of this thinking cannot remain same. Okay? So, actually, what we later interpret happens here. This is the discovery of these certain subjects having its own history. Okay? The subject under question has given a specific name by Hegel. Okay? It was not necessary, but to be able to distinguish his new kind of conceptualization, okay, he needed perhaps to name it with a different word. Okay? So, Geist turns out to be our modern subject. Okay? Actually, in all our modern endeavors of studying history, we are looking for this, okay? The certain specific realization of this in this historical period and at that specific society, okay? Simply because when we understand the history as the world history, or when we understand history as the history of the universe, it's just an easy step to take to find the history of one particular society within that larger history. Okay? For instance, I am talking about the history of humanity, say, starting some 40 million years ago. Okay? Now, even this expression shows you that I am locating something I call as human history into the larger structure of the history of universe. Okay? If I did not do so, I wouldn't be able to give you that numbers since 4 million years ago. Okay? 4 million years ago can only appear here, okay, only in reference to this larger history, okay? History of the universe, history of the solar system, whatever you like, okay? Or I am talking about the history of Turkish modernization, for instance. What do I imply here? I imply that there is modernization, the modernization as a larger process, and at the same time which can be specified at a certain society, which is called Turkish society. So the history of modernization of Turkish society should necessarily be studied in connection with the larger history of modernization. Apart from that, you cannot think of any history of Turkish modernization or whatever it is. Okay? That's strange. Already implies and already contains all, as you can see. Okay? So this is that Geist we are talking about, that which contains all. Now, Hegelian idea was that, the interesting idea, yeah, Kant was right in many of his premises, and actually Kantian discovery, okay, shows the degree of a new degree, higher degree of sophistication of our concepts of understanding. Okay? In other words, Kant's thinking constitutes a certain highly developed stage of the I said already actually, so that this will be, the remaining part will be a redundancy, nothing else now. Stage of the development of, if you like, thinking or Geist. Okay? So, if we are able to talk about the development of the Geist just by looking at its, the latest stages or achievements it creates, okay, then why not starting from the very beginning to be able to better understanding, develop a better understanding of that Geist itself? Okay. So, Hegelian argument, especially in his phenomenology of the spirit, that's a very thick, famous, beautifully written book. Phenomenologie des Geistes. Okay. Let me say the one point here, how we should understand Geist here. Okay, usually, if you take a look at Turkish translations, you'll find out the word tin here. Okay. I'm discussing this with many of my friends. I'm still on the idea that actually this is a mistranslation, misnomer, so to speak. Actually creating no implications in the Turkish reader. Okay. The true translation should be ruh, if you like. Okay. Actually, a term borrowed from the Hebrew ruach. You know. An English term as well, spirit. And we should not negate that it has some religious connotations as well. Okay? Yes, it has religious connotations as well. So what we are talking about here is ruh, okay? Not tin. Tin, what does it mean? I do not know. It does not make any sense to my understanding, for instance. But ruh does perfectly sense. Okay. So everything is in the Geists. Geist is nothing else than the all of existence, which is nothing else than thinking itself. Okay? So its first expression, and put in an historical perspective, would demand you to start from the beginning, of course. Okay? And beginning for Hegel was its first expression. First expression is nothing else than the material nature. In other words, all the world of inanimate beings, material nature. We are not talking about life itself. Geist is nothing else than, let me add this description as well to our understanding of Geist. Okay. nothing else than the totality of the life of thinking, if you like. Okay? Totality of the life of thinking. Thinking being itself an activity, a movement, okay, considered to be alive, so to speak. So all this history is nothing else than the actualization of the life of thinking. Okay? Now, it expresses itself in the beginning in the form of the material nature. We do not know yet actually the real meanings of the terms we are right now mentioning, talking, making use of. Okay? So material nature. Later on, within the material nature, later on, the spirit shows itself as sense certainty. Understood in physical evolutionary terms, one could say that out of material nature, some form of life begins to shape, begins to get shape. Okay? Now, this form of life now is so primitive that it is yet still devoid of understanding, so it cannot understand. Okay? It cannot even possibly perceive the things, but it has a certain simplest, basic level of sensibility. Okay, that's all. Sense certainty, according to this, is one of the most difficult aspects for us to express, simply because we are all talking this from the level of understanding. Kant had developed the framework of understanding. And within the Hegelian framework, if Geist had not arrived at that stage, a philosopher, someone like Kant, would not be able to describe its structure. Okay? So, even Kant's success in showing the structure of the understanding owes its possibility to it is already actualized development. Okay? In the history of Geist. So, however, we are talking about this from somewhere from here. And this is why talk about it turns out to be so difficult. But Hegel finds a term to express the simplicity of the situation. That at that stage, okay, what spirit experiences is nothing else than the realization of this. Okay? In other words, I come across with this, but I do not know what it is. Okay? I do not have any idea how to make sense of this. Okay? I do not know even that it functions right now as a barrier before me, okay, hindering me to go any further, etc. Okay, no idea. A simple this. Okay. In a later development, after that, these are states. You can understand this simply because one requires the other, and I'll talk about the dynamics of the passage from one to the other, okay, as well later on. The second stage is the rise of perception. Okay. I can say that if the rise of sense certainty, actually there are two kinds of histories here going parallel, hand in hand together. Okay. One is the transformations in the material nature as the expression of the transformations within the structure of the spirit, Geist. Okay? So the new emergences in the material nature are nothing else than the expressions of the real developments taking place in the structure of the Geist, spirit. Okay? So when spirit develops out of its own contradictions, the possibility of perception, in other words, just like as it was the case with sense certainty, a new form within the material nature makes its appearance. Okay? Now, these were for instance, with sense certainty, we can begin to talk about the appearance of the animate beings. Okay. And with the development of perception, actually we can talk about the rise of the animals. Okay. Perception is understood as different, categorically different from sense certainty, simply because to be able to talk about perception, one needs to have concepts. Okay? Without concepts, one cannot talk about perception. So it is through having this or that level of simplicity of concepts, one can begin to now make sense of particular experiences. Okay? Now this is why we call it perception. Okay? Yani experiences, or in Kantian language, intuitions, this time beginning to make sense with the notion of perception. Okay? Now, which is followed by understanding. Okay? Followed by understanding. Of course, this time what's at stake is almost something close to the Kantian exposition of understanding. Okay? Now, out of this understanding and returning from this point on to backwards, okay, to the past, now we can begin to make sense of the unity of this history. Okay? Simply because understanding, as we have already seen, involves categories, okay? Involves categories as well as a radical separation of the external and internal. I'm going to talk about another third parallel history, this time taking the inner developments of Geist as itself. Okay? Now, here, however, we are following the simple history, which is nothing else than the rather expression of the structure of the book, Phenomenology of the Spirit. Okay? This is the, so to speak, externally, overtly expressed history of the Geist. Okay? We will see that actually real thinking, real philosophy does not start with phenomenology, but only it starts when phenomenology ends. Okay? Simply because the aim here, okay, the aim here is to overcome the Kantian duality, which is understood as nothing else than the expression of the spirit's alienation from its own self. Okay? Now, how this alienation was understood, I tried briefly to introduce to you in Fichte's schema. Okay? It has been already alienated itself, so therefore capable of establishing itself as some separate unity in contradistinction to another unity of the world. Okay? So this means that the unity of the conceptual framework has been achieved also. Okay? So out of this unity of conceptual framework, understanding looks at itself, in other words. Okay? Of course, this would correspond with the rise of the human, okay, in the material nature. Actually, together, these three constitute what Hegel called as consciousness. Okay? We have arrived at the stage of consciousness with understanding. We have completed, in other words, the development of consciousness within the larger history of Geist. Okay? Why Hegel does not call it consciousness? Simply because consciousness would constitute only one historical moment in the larger history of the spirit. Okay? So, consciousness. Well, unfortunately, the development of spirit does not stop at the stage of consciousness, the later of which, okay, we are going to talk about after break.